In this video, we're talking about logging in our applications. I'm going to show you how you can create a MediatR pipeline behavior to solve logging as a cross-cutting concern. I'm going to discuss what and how much you want to log, and also how to configure the log level through application settings. Let's start off by creating a MediatR pipeline behavior in the application layer. I'm going to create a behaviors folder, and inside of it I'm going to add a new class which is going to represent our logging pipeline behavior, and that's what I'm going to name it. To make this class into a pipeline behavior, I need to make it a generic class, so I'm going to add two generic arguments which are going to represent my request and response. So I'm going to name them tRequest and tResponse. Now I need to implement the iPipeline behavior interface, and I'm going to specify the tRequest and tResponse generic arguments. So let me go ahead and add that. Because I have custom command and query interface definitions, I'm going to add a few generic constraints. The first generic constraint is going to be for tRequest that it has to be an instance of iRequest, and a generic one returning a tResponse. And now I'm going to add a generic constraint for the tResponse generic argument, and I'm going to say that the tResponse has to be a result which is coming from my domain project. This completes the definition for the logging pipeline behavior, and now I need to implement the interface. As you can see, the interface has one handle method that we need to implement, and we get the request and request handler delegate as the arguments. The simplest implementation is going to be to await the request handler delegate execution, store that into a result, and just return that from the handle method. I'm going to start off by making the handle method asynchronous, and then I'm going to execute our request handler delegate. I'm going to say var result, and I'm just going to await the execution of the request handler delegate, and we can return that result and complete our handle method. So how do we introduce logging here? We're going to start off by injecting an iLogger instance. So I'm going to create a private read-only field that is going to represent our logger. We're going to use the iLogger interface, which is coming from the Microsoft Extensions logging namespace, and I'm going to specify the logging pipeline behavior as the generic argument. So let's create the logger instance, and we're going to inject it from the constructor. So now that we have our iLogger instance, we can introduce logging inside of the handle method. So what are the things that would be meaningful to log inside of the handle method? For example, we would want to add a log before executing the request handler and also after executing the request handler. That way, we are going to be able to track our MediatR requests through the pipeline and have log statements showing us what was going on during that request. So let's start off by adding an information log before executing the request. I'm going to say log information, and let's add the message inside. I'm going to say starting request. And now I'm going to define a few placeholder variables, and I'm going to explain what I'm going to do in a moment. I'm going to open curly brackets. I'm going to add a placeholder inside of the brackets, and I'm going to call it request name. And I'm going to define a few additional placeholders. One thing that would be interesting to log would be the current date and time. So let's add that. I'm going to say date time UTC. I think this is good enough to start out. Now I need to specify the values for these placeholders. So we're going to start off from the request name. I'm going to say type of tRequest, and I'm just going to pass in the name of this type as the request name. And for the current date time, I'm going to say date time UTC now. You can see that when I select the argument, the proper placeholder inside of the log message is also highlighted. What I'm doing here is called structured logging. I'm not only formatting the log message as a string, I'm also adding the request name and the current date and time as additional metadata on the log message. And if I were using a logging provider that supported structured logging, an example of that would be Serilog, which I'm going to cover in another video. It's going to be able to take that metadata and serialize it into a JSON value and store that as the log message. This is going to allow me to search my log messages much more efficiently. For example, we would be able to filter the logs by the request name and see what information we can gather from that. Let's also add another log statement after we complete our request handler. I'm going to say completed request as the message, and we're going to have the request name and the current date time inside of the metadata. This is good enough to start out, so let's configure our logging pipeline behavior with dependency injection. Right here where I'm configuring MediatR, I'm going to say builder services, and I'm going to add a scoped service, which is going to be our pipeline behavior. I'm going to say type of iPipeline behavior, and we're going to specify our logging pipeline behavior as the implementation. So this is going to configure our logging pipeline behavior as a valid pipeline behavior with MediatR. And now we can start our application and see how logging is working. I'm going to send a few requests to our API from Postman, and you're going to see that we're getting a few log messages in the output console. I want to highlight a few things. You can see that we have the information log level defined here. Then you can see the source of the log, which is our logging pipeline behavior. And then you get our log message, which contains the request name, which is the get products query in this instance, and the time when the request was started. And then we have the log below that representing when the request was completed and at what time. So at the moment we're only logging when our request was started and when it was completed. But because we are returning a result instance here, we can check if the result was a success or a failure and log some additional information based on that. So I can say if result is failure. So if the result is a failure, I can decide I want to add a log statement, and I'm not sure what log level would be appropriate. I can choose from information, critical, debug, error, trace, or warning. Let's say we want to log an error when we have a failure result. So we would do the same thing as we did before. And let's copy this from over here where we log the information statement. So instead of starting request, we can say request failure. We'll leave the request name as it is. We'll also leave the date and time, and I'm going to add another placeholder here, which is going to represent our error instance that occurred in this situation. And let's pass in that error instance to our log message by accessing the result error property. So now when we encounter a failure in our request pipeline, we're going to be logging an error message, and it's going to contain an additional metadata property, which is going to represent our log. I'm going to show you an example of that. I'm going to send a put request to our API to try to update a product, but I'm going to use an ID that does not exist in the database. And you can see that we get a failure level log message right here, telling us that the request failed for the update product command. The error was that the product was not found, and this is the date and time when the error occurred. If you are enjoying this video about logging, make sure that you smash that like button and also subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any of my future videos. One thing that could be problematic if your application has a high number of requests is that you're going to be generating a lot of log statements. Not all of those log statements are going to have value, so you want to be able to control what is the minimum log level that is going to be recorded in your logs. You can do that by setting the log level in your application settings. We want to set the default log level, and let's change it from information to warning. And now if we run our application and try to log information logs, you're going to see they're not going to show up. I added a breakpoint at the start of the logging pipeline behavior, and I'm going to send a put request for a non-existing product. Watch what's going to happen in the output window when we try to add our information log. You can see that it's not added, and now we execute our request. We get a failure response, and this time we're going to log an error level log. And as you can see, it's going to show up in the output window. And let's try for our last log, which is after our request completes. This is an information level log, but the minimum log level is warning. And if I execute that statement, you can see that we don't get the log in the output window. So this is how you can solve logging as a cross-cutting concern inside of your application. If you enjoyed this video, leave it a like and also subscribe to my channel. And until next time, stay awesome.